Well, first of all, my name is Bruce Scott, and I currently have the honor and privilege of serving as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Olmsted Foundation. I am delighted that all of you are here tonight. You're going to be hearing the fourth Olmsted Lecture. Now, before we talk about the lecture, let's talk about George Olmsted. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. He did not build Central Park. He knows nothing about the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and he had nothing to do with a little-known park called the Elm Tree Park in Worcester, Massachusetts, okay? That's Frederick Law Olmsted. This is George Olmsted. And now, who is George Olmsted? Well, he's a farm boy from Iowa, right middle of the U.S. George Olmsted graduated from high school. His brother, Gerald, graduated a year ahead of him, but went to prep school for a year. They both headed out. Gerald went to the United States Naval Academy, that young school, and George went to West Point. What's interesting is they both graduated in 1922, and the brothers were both #1 cadets and first captains at each academy. To my knowledge, that's never happened since then. So fascinating. Now, tragically, Gerald Olmsted, when he was an ensign, 1 year into service, had just gotten engaged. His ship was home ported in New York City. He came down with a terrible fever. They evacuated him to New York City Hospital, and he died the next day as an ensign. They believe it was spinal meningitis. They don't know. The hospital later burnt down. They don't have the records. Well, George Olmsted then served in the Army a short period of time initially, and then got out and got into finance and banking. We are so thankful that he got into finance and banking. Had he stayed in the Army, he would have been poor like me, okay? He got into finance and banking, was called back to active duty right in World War II, and quickly was promoted from major, lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. And why? He was a logistician, among other things, but the most successful thing he did, he repatriated all American prisoners of war from Japan without having any casualties, to include General Wainwright and others, got them out of Japan without any casualties. But what he noticed, this farm boy from Iowa, is that American service members, whether they be soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, or even Coast Guardmen, they were woefully ignorant of cultures in other countries, just had no idea. He was then later called back to active duty in Korea, did similar things, not with the prisoner of war, but with logistics, and then retired as a major general from the reserve. Well, 60 years ago this year, he decided to take his personal fortune and give a little bit to a foundation he called the Olmsted Foundation. Now, he was smart enough to get Congress to pass a law to allow the foundation to take active duty military officers and do the program he wanted. Initially, it was 6 a year, two Army, 2 Navy, 2 Air Force. Well, he decided, he set the criteria. He said, U.S. officers are not broadly educated enough. So what do? We've been around, this is our 60th year. When we select the officers and the board selects them, and the services give us their best and brightest young lieutenants and captains, they apply to the program, they go through a rigorous screening process, and then what we do is we send the scholar and his or her spouse to language training up to a year, and then we insert them into a country of their choice where they have to get admitted into grad school, they take graduate lessons in the native language, and about 80% get a master's degree entirely done in a foreign language in a foreign country. We also give them money to travel, and we tell them to immerse in the local culture. And then when we bring them back, we don't make them foreign area officers. We make them, if they're driving a ship before they went in, they drive a ship when they come back. If they're an airborne ranger leading combat soldiers, that's what they do. The whole purpose of the program is a leadership experience done in a foreign university in a foreign language. And it teaches our young scholars a lot about themselves that they give back to both society and the military. In total, we've had 683 Olmsted scholars. They've studied in 218 universities in 63 countries and in 42 languages. That's the program for 60 years. 44 of our Olmsted Scholars have been privileged enough to get promoted to flag rank. We have many CEOs of significant companies. Just today, Major General D.T. Thompson was selected Air Force for his 3rd star. He'll be promoted shortly. And on Friday, when Olmsted Scholar Jamie Fogo gets promoted and his 4th star, this pains me as a West Point graduate to say it, but 25% of the Navy 4-star admirals will be Olmsted Scholars. 25%. So that's the program. I'm reminded, and I used this last year, that Thucydides, the great Greek general, scholar, warrior, historian, he said a society that has a demarcation between its warriors and its scholars will have its fighting done by fools and its legislation done by cowards. We're just the opposite of that. We take our scholars. Mary and I, my wife and I, spent 14 days in Latin America, visited 6 scholars and their families in 6 cities and 3 countries. No, we didn't go to the Galapagos. Everybody said, go to Patagonia. No, we visited scholars. All entirely fluent, children in the class. We have an F-22 pilot, Jonathan Hassel, Major, studying in Brazilian Portuguese in Florianopolis, which is Hawaii, 40 years ago. And when he finishes his program later this year, he's going to go back and fly the F-22. We don't expect them to contribute as young lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, or majors, but right now we have Olmsted Scholars serving in the White House, in the State Department, on the Joint Staff, and heck, our speaker tonight's taken every Olmsted Scholar who speaks Spanish or Portuguese and put them on his staff, okay? So that's what the program is. I'm delighted you're here. Our chairman of our board, Vice Admiral retired Doug Crowder, will be introducing our guest speaker. We debated it. He won because he's senior. I should have done it because of similar haircuts, but Doug's going to do it anyway. Now, Doug, I will tell you, this could be his last time as chairman. He's been an outstanding chairman for the past 4 years. He, in fact, this session tonight was a brainchild of Doug Crowder. So, Doug, I thank you for that. Now, Doug also studied, often we get scholars saying, I want to study in Asia because I'm going to be an Asian. I need to do all that. Well, I'll let you know. Doug Crowder, our Olmsted Scholar, studied in Lausanne, Switzerland, class of 1980. In case you don't know your geography that much, the Swiss Navy is really, really, I mean really small, okay? So it doesn't matter where you study. It matters that you go through this experience. A scholar coming back says, the military is now talking about taking us and making you think outside the box. What we do at this foundation and what these young scholars out here do is we put them outside the box and tell them to think. That's what the program is. It's vibrant and healthy after 60 years, and we hope it continues for the next 60. So Doug, I'll let you introduce our wonderful guest speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I just want to reiterate a couple of things that Bruce said. We are now 60 years into this program of choosing young junior officers from all 5 services. Okay, we didn't do the Coast Guard until last year, but we're lucky to have the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard with us, Admiral Chuck Michelle. Thank you for coming, and I promise for the next 60 years there will be a Coast Guardman that's selected as an Olmsted Scholar, and I think it's an investment that will pay off for your service in years to come. I'd like to ask the directors of the Olmsted Foundation to stand up, and I just want to introduce you so that everyone sees you and can talk to you. We have Dr. Chris Howard. Please raise your hand. Dr. Howard is an Air Force Academy grad and is currently the president of Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh. It's a great addition to our foundation board of directors. Torkel Patterson is a national security expert, having served in the White House on a number of occasions, and the State Department in key jobs. Kathy Gaudier, retired colonel as well. Bruce Scott, obviously, is on our directors. Bob McClure, Colonel, United States Army, and was recently the president and CEO of the Association of Graduates at that older academy on up north of here. Vice Admiral Phil Weitzcup. Oh, Phil. Phil has just been retired 3-star admiral and has just been named the Vice Chancellor of the North Dakota University System. Except for it's in North Dakota. I mean, yeah. Before you congratulate him, you ought to know that. We also have on our board active duty directors that allow us to reach into the services. First of all, Captain Dave Sauvé, who's our Navy director, Colonel Joe Hilbert. Joe's getting in late. And Colonel Steve Wolf, United States Marine Corps, is our active duty director for Marine Corps. Okay, thanks very much. It is a real honor tonight to introduce Admiral Kurt Tidd. We go way back in our careers. I would tell you, I had the honor of introducing Admiral Jim Stavridis here 2 years ago as our guest. And there's a lot of similarity between Jim Stavridis and Kurt Tidd. Same part of the Navy. Both graduates of the Naval Academy, went off to frontline destroyers, and then got their careers sidetracked by a program that the Washington dreamed up called the Carrier Readiness Improvement Program. Of course, no program is worth the salt if it doesn't have an acronym, and so it was the CV RIP program, and what a rip it was. So both Jim and Kurt got picked for that program. The thought process, at least from the Washington perspective, is we're going to take the very best lieutenant junior grades in the Navy and put them on our carriers in the engineering department, because the engineering readiness of our carriers was pretty darn poor after the Vietnam War. I have on good authority that both Jim and Kurt went there kicking and screaming because they had other visions of what their career would look like, but they went because that's why they called them orders. Now the reason for it, one of our carriers had such a terrible engineering casualty. Well, I'll just jump to the good news. The flooding put the fire out. Okay, so it was, you know, it came out okay. Although the commanding officer of the carrier actually sent his crew to abandoned ship quarters. So the thought was, we've got to take our very best talent, and we don't care what you thought you were going to do. You're going to go to the carrier and be the boilers officer on USS America CV-66, and that's what Kurt did. I'm sure it was a lot of fun. At least that's what I understand. But then we picked him to be an Olmsted Scholar, got him out of the engineering spaces and sent him to Bordeaux, France, and came back from that experience like most of us who are scholars, and was a much broader thinker. Now, Jim Stavridis was not an Olmsted Scholar, and he said to me, Kurt, with no vanity, he said, Crowder, I decided to go to Tufts and get a PhD, otherwise you would have not been an Olmsted Scholar. There was really no vanity to it. It did hurt, not that he said it because it was true, is why it hurt. But Kurt, like a lot of us who are Olmsted Scholars, that opportunity really changed his life. You know, you have a much broader perspective on things, and most importantly, you come back and you learn to seek the perspective of others. and listen and understand why others do things the way they do it. The result, every tour after that, Kurt was sent to one of our key billets in the Pentagon where we needed someone with a really big brain who understood strategy, and we kept sending him there. He had assignments in the strategy division of the Navy. He was a key member of the CNO's executive panel that would look at, ahead 10 years and where the Navy ought to go. He was the Secretary of Navy's strategic planner, and on and on and on. Then 9/11 hit, and this is where I'm going to bring Stavridis and Tidd back together. 9/11 hit, and the Chief of Naval Operations decided that the Navy was not responding adequately. We were still had these great visions of being out in the deep blue and just hoping the backfire bombers would come back out and play with us. And so we tapped brand new Admiral Jim Stavridis to set up an organization to look at how to get the bow of the Navy over a little bit to start adequately facing the war on terror. And so Jim set up a small cell, and he called it, really tongue-in-cheek, Deep Blue. And the first guy he grabbed was Kurt Tidd, because Jim Stavridis is no fool. Later, we sent Kurt out to the NSC staff. We spent 3 years as the head of the Director of Combating Terrorism shop there. As a flag, he had a lot of key jobs. He was the Director of Operations for the Joint Staff. His most recent job before his current one was the assistant to the chairman, which really means he was the assistant to the Secretary of State. And wherever the Secretary of State would go, Kurt would go as his alter ego and give him the military background on things and just help him develop a lot of strategy. So that's what happened with Kurt Tidd. Now, of course, on the operational side, Kurt was no slacker. He was CO of a destroyer. He was the ops officer out at NAVCENT. Later went on to command the destroyer squadron that's permanently out there during wartime. Commanded the Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group and was a numbered fleet commander, the 4th Fleet, which was also NAV South, which gave him a real good taste of what to expect in his current job. Now, obviously, Kurt is the commander, United States Southern Command. It's one of only 6 combatant commands that the United States military has. It encompasses 45 different nations and over 16 million square miles. It's a big job. It's a big AOR. Personally, I want to tell you that with all of that, Kurt's a shipmate. That's a Navy saying, and I'm sure the other services have a saying along the same lines. But when you say a person is a shipmate, that means something. That doesn't mean that he serves on the same ship with you. You know, that's when you say we're shipmates. But Kurt's a shipmate. The best definition of shipmate I read back in 2009, and let me read it to you. I'll just quote it. A shipmate is someone who you trust with your very life. And at the same time, he trusts you with his life. And that's what Kurt Tidd is. Now, the author of that was yours truly in an article I wrote. And I've known Kurt for 40 years. He is a shipmate. A shipmate is always there when you need him. That's the good news. A shipmate expects you to be there when he needs you, if he thinks you're a shipmate. And I was thrilled to find out that Kurt thinks that I too am a shipmate. And this came home to me a couple years ago when I was at home on a Thursday evening, and Kurt called me, and I said, hello, I hadn't talked to him in a while. I said, hey, great, Kurt, it's great to catch up. Thanks for calling. He says, I don't have time to talk. Oh, then why'd you call? He said, are you going to Admiral Harbison's retirement ceremony tomorrow at the Naval Academy? I go, yeah, I was thinking about going. I said, I understand you're speaking. He goes, I'm on the plane in 20 minutes with Secretary Kerry, and I told Admiral Harbison you'd give a speech. Well, shipmate, been a while since I pulled an all-nighter. Ladies and gentlemen, my shipmate, Admiral Kurt Tidd.
So my shipmate called me a couple of months ago. And here I am. Doug, thanks very much. I appreciate the stories and the introduction. I would just point out, for those of you who know him well, Jim Stavridis has been a mentor to me for much of my career. And what I try and point out to people, yes, he was a former commander of U.S. Southern Command. Yes, we were both Carrier Readiness Improvement Program officers, as was Doug Crowder, who was the guy who got me into the program, shipmate. Yes. But truth in advertising, I try and tell people, yes, I have Jim Stavridis' haircut, but not his intellect. So I want to make sure we're clear on that one. This is, it's an honor, it's a privilege. I look out at this audience, and although we've only done this program now for 4 years, I do recall when I was sitting in some of the back rows in the age of some of the folks at the mid-grade and officers, and I remember back then, as we looked at some of the leaders of this particular program and some of the senior officers in the program, and all I could think was, man, those guys are really old. And I'm just glad to say that it's not like that anymore. So, Doug, thanks for the introduction. General Scott, thank you very much for this invitation to be able to join all of you tonight. It's great to be here, and I'm really honored to be able to support this wonderful organization that all of the scholars in the audience know so well and appreciate and understand just exactly what a life-changing experience it really is. This organization has played an important role in our lives, but it's important, I think, that we also recognize it's played a role in our national security. It's played a fundamental role in shaping so many of our future leaders. So the Olmsted Scholar experience is it is unique, and I won't drag folks through it, but I would echo it is one that has never been afraid to change. It has continued to evolve. It started just picking 2 officers from the Army, from the Navy, from the Air Force. It expanded beyond that. This year, how many scholars did 20 officers spread across all 5 of our services. And I would like to specifically point out that for the very first time, we have a U.S. Coast Guard officer, Lieutenant Melissa Martinelli. Melissa, where are you sitting? Please stand up. Melissa is a trailblazer. And I'm particularly proud to say that Melissa will be going to a university in Argentina in U.S. Southern Command AOR. So watch out where you wind up being stationed after that. We keep an eye on all of the SOUTHCOM stationed officers. I've been fortunate enough to have 2 as aides over the course of the last 2 years, and it's been a terrific opportunity. You've heard the numbers, you've heard the statistics, the number of people who've done this program. So let's just all accept that being an Olmsted Scholar changes how we view the world. It changes how we understand our place in it. It makes us appreciate the differences, but more importantly, to recognize the similarities across so many different cultures. It also ingrains in us the importance of American engagement and the critical role that engagement plays in national security. Where we engage, we build respect for human rights, and we lead alliances of like-minded nations in worthy causes. Where we don't, we see challenges festering, order eroding, and vacuums filled. Tonight, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the importance of American engagement and leadership in one part of the world in particular, and that's in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, despite what the headlines may suggest in terms of geographic proximity, culture, trade, and homeland security, no other region has more impact on daily life here in our country. History has taught us that there are costs to ignoring security challenges, especially in this hemisphere. We walk away from problems, they come to us. Geographic proximity guarantees it. There are costs to missing opportunities as well, because if we don't seize them, others will exploit our absence. This is why engagement is so important. It's why the Western Hemisphere is a priority for the administration. Vice President Pence recently said it best: a prosperous Latin America means a prosperous United States. A secure Latin America means a more secure United States. As I hope you will soon agree, the challenges in this region merit our engagement, but so do the opportunities. So let's start with those. Now, after a challenging decade, anti-American regimes are on the decline. The continued assault on democracy in Venezuela has unified like-minded nations in defense of our shared values. And everywhere that we look, we see partners who want to work with us, and they want to work with each other in order to address our shared security challenges. This last trend is due in no small part to sustained engagement by the U.S. government writ large, and the U.S. military in particular. As part of the Global Peacekeeping Operations Initiative, we train approximately 4,000 peacekeeping troops every single year. Nations like Brazil and Uruguay are now major contributors to UN missions, helping maintain stability in war-torn states and troubled regions around the world. Through decades of multilateral exercises, we've helped our partners become more capable and more interoperable with the U.S. and with our allies. We're fielding innovative technologies, and we're improving readiness by collaborating with highly capable partners like Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and many more. Many nations now play the role of security exporters, sharing their expertise with their partners in Central America and transatlantic partners in Africa. They're working together to address the growth of interconnected, borderless challenges like the spread of illicit networks, the threat of violent extremism, and the impact of natural disasters. These are concerns that blur the line between security and defense. They're concerns that don't just affect one nation in the Western Hemisphere, but every nation in the Western Hemisphere. And because these concerns are right here in our shared home, they have the potential to directly threaten our homeland. They have the potential to undermine the region's progress and the peace that we have all worked so hard to achieve. We ignore these challenges today, we risk the emergence of much larger, more complex ones down the road. Just look at the evolution of illicit networks. Propelled by the forces of globalization, criminal and extremist networks have evolved, becoming more connected, more ruthless, and more powerful. Once upon a time, all we worried about was stopping drugs and the people that were involved in smuggling them. Now, we face amorphous, loosely affiliated groups who can move anything and anyone along a vast network of illicit pathways, who conduct and coordinate operations that are trans-regional and sometimes even global in reach and scope. We face groups who have the access to the latest technology and use it to evade law enforcement. We face groups who do more than just move illicit products. We face groups that are destructive and destabilizing, whose actions undermine and erode the state from within, and they threaten the very legitimacy of democratic governance. Once upon a time, we used to talk about ungoverned spaces, remote rural areas where government presence is minimal and criminal groups operate freely. Now, we also talk about alternatively governed spaces, where transnational criminal gangs exert a level of influence and control that was formerly reserved to the state. These groups can and do order attacks against security forces, against judges, against institutions. They control parts of urban cities and a great many more prisons. They occasionally blow up buses as a negotiating tactic, or they paralyze entire neighborhoods in violent turf wars. They possess capabilities that can far outmatch law enforcement, forcing some nations to rely on their militaries to contain what was, a decade ago, purely a police problem. They are adaptive and dynamic, constantly reacting and learning from each other and from us. They also control a global market that's worth an estimated $2 trillion in illegal goods and services. Now, that dirty money flows through the global financial system, distorting our economies and eroding the rule of law. It helps both criminal and terrorist organizations finance and expand their operations, creating insecurity and instability across the globe, and right here at home. Although we see some evidence of overlap, the truth is that criminal and extremist networks don't have to work together to benefit from each other's activities. They both thrive on and contribute to the same permissive environment. And through the different webs of corruption and criminality that they create, they enable illicit space for one another to operate. These networks make our world, and especially our hemisphere, a much more dangerous place. When you have illicit networks operating in places that are prone to instability or natural disasters, you add in another layer of complexity. Instability and the chaos of crisis and its aftermath can create space for illicit networks to thrive. The aftermath of a natural disaster can also exacerbate underlying conditions like medical and food insecurity, which can eventually drive thousands of migrants to enlist the services of human smuggling networks, coyotes, and other unscrupulous organizations who profit from misery and desperation. Now, the good news is that none of these challenges is insurmountable, but all of them warrant our continued engagement. This engagement underwrites U.S. leadership in the region, but it also is cost-effective and crisis preventative. We support our partners as they deal with problems in and around their own territories. They build and employ their capacities to deal with emerging challenges. We foster greater regional cooperation. Nations come together to tackle shared problems. Together, we share the burden of safeguarding our shared home and contributing to international stability. Now, this is a modest investment that pays enormous long-term advantages and dividends in terms of our interests, our security, and ultimately, our future. I'd like to share a couple of examples that illustrate this point. We've been working side by side with Mexico and Colombia. Now they are stepping forward to help Central America combat the spread of criminal networks, and they're exploring ways to coordinate international drug interdiction efforts. This is significant because 40% of all U.S.-led drug interdiction successes would not be possible without the contributions of Central American and Colombian navies and coast guards. In the Caribbean, the U.S. government invested in training and exercising with regional organizations like the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency, CARICOM's regional security system, and countries like Jamaica, Barbados, and many others. And while the devastation wrought by Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Dominica, St. Martin, and other Caribbean nations was severe, what happened after the hurricane was even more important. Regional organizations and neighboring countries quickly responded, often without the Department of Defense help, delivering troops and supplies to their neighbors in need and organizing large-scale relief efforts. The crisis in Puerto Rico has understandably overshadowed this piece of good news, but we must recognize it is very good news. We've seen how disaster response can quickly tax the U.S. military and lead to all sorts of ripple effects in deployment timelines. Investing in and building and enhancing regional response capacities can help minimize the need for a large and sometimes lengthy DoD role. Of course, when it comes to helping friends solve their own problems or setting up partners for success, there's no better example than our relationship with Colombia. The United States may have invested more than $9 billion over the course of Plan Colombia, but the Colombians themselves outspent us 4-1. In just over a decade, Colombia has transformed from a near-failed state into a major regional player with political influence, a highly capable professional security force, and a dynamic economy. They continue to face security challenges, especially in the form of rising cocaine production, but they remain committed to working with us to address these challenges. Given the price tag that illicit drugs cost the American economy, every year estimated at $193 billion, investing in Colombia's security and prosperity is a much smarter bet. And in the face of competition for partnerships, the single best thing that we can do is just that, to engage, to reinforce existing partnerships, build new relationships, and above all, to demonstrate our enduring commitment to our partners. When the U.S. military engages on human rights, or helps build stronger security institutions, or expands regional alliances, we demonstrate that what we build lasts, that we're in it for the long haul, and that we are committed to the long-term stability, security, and prosperity of our shared home and to our partners within it. So that's my main message to all of you, a message that I think General Olmsted would agree with. Forging connections with the rest of the world is good for American security, good for American leadership, and absolutely priceless for American interests. Nowhere is that more true than here in our own hemisphere. So as we engage forward, let's not forget to look south. Look to our friends, to our neighbors who share our values and our common interests, who are doing their part to keep our hemisphere safe, and by extension, our nation secure. There is no better return on engagement than that. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand. I can bring you the microphone. Sir?
This may be an unfair question, but, you know, shipmate.
I would expect nothing else.
How does the sorry saga of Venezuela end? Your personal view.
You know, I have a Twitter handle, and one of the things that I have learned is that, and it's not just me, any U.S. Southern Command commander who utters the word Venezuela, their Twitter feed immediately blows up. You know, because I'm immediately accused of planning the invasion of Venezuela. I'm not planning the invasion of Venezuela. I don't mean to make light of the absolute human tragedy that is occurring there. And, you know, we read about it. We all, we see the stories. We understand just the drama of the day-to-day livelihood of the Venezuelan people who are struggling to find food, medicine, health care for their children, just the very basics of survival. And it's a country that has been blessed with some of the richest natural resources in the world. And so there is a human dimension to the tragedy that we're all watching. All of the neighboring countries are watching very closely. I think, we were encouraged by the response from these neighboring countries, from the OAS, from the Lima Group, who have come together and expressed I think the heartfelt feelings of the democracies of the region that the Venezuelan people have had democracy stolen from them. So it is an unfortunate set of circumstances. Ultimately, it will be the region and the countries and the neighbors are going to find themselves in a situation where they will have to come together to help the people of Venezuela. But ultimately, I think we should all hope that the people of Venezuela, that their suffering is brought to an end soon. Thanks.
Hello, Admiral Paul Siebold, Olmsted Scholar from St. Petersburg, Russia. How do you see Russia and China in terms of what they'd like to achieve in Latin America?
I think these are countries that see opportunity. They are present throughout Latin America. They have interests that they are pursuing, and so I think it's important that we not ignore that. We have for so many years taken for granted the relationships that we have with the countries here in our hemisphere, and we've just believed that they would always be there. We are all countries born from a common heritage, born from having gained independence from colonial powers, and we share common values. We work together very, very closely, but they are relationships that ultimately are ours to lose through neglect. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to recognize that there is a competition for influence, and we must be willing, I think, to embrace that competition and to be able to demonstrate to our partners here in the Western Hemisphere that we value the strength of the relationship, and that if we remain engaged, that we will be able to continue to work together. Thanks.
Sir, Bob McClure, class of '83 from Mainz, Germany. Quickly about Brazil. They've had some ups and downs lately, particularly since the last Olympics, and really it's been very quiet. What's your judgment on Brazil and how their role, obviously being the large South, your area are, how's that really going to play? What's your view on Brazil? This is a country with a significant economy, with global interests, and with one of the most professional militaries across all of the hemisphere. We work together very, very closely. I think I'm fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of the wise counsel. Our civilian deputy down at USSOUTHCOM Command, Ambassador Liliana Ayalde, just came from spending 3 years as the U.S. ambassador to Brazil. And so we continue to seek opportunities to be able to strengthen that military-to-military relationship. And we find that because of a long-standing tradition of having worked together, these military-to-military relationships can serve as a buffer through periods of kind of political ups and downs, which are inevitable, which occur in many relationships. But because we know each other, we have worked together in the past, and I think there is an intense desire to continue to keep those lines alive. We see that being able to work with Brazil in the future could probably be a very powerful signal to other countries around the world that when like-minded democracies are able to come together, and we can solve all manner of problems. So Brazil has been a terrific leader. When I talked about peacekeeping operations, up until really just this month, they led the long-standing UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti and were absolutely stalwart in providing that disciplined, thoughtful leadership on the ground in Haiti that allowed other countries to be able to come in and work together. And we see it, we see that they continue to exercise a leadership role. We run a series of exercises. Our capstone exercise in USSOUTHCOM Command is Panamax exercise, and in this particular one, for the last 2 years now, all of the the component commander roles have been exercised by partner nations in the region. This past year, the land component commander for that exercise was Brazil. They did a terrific job. I mean, they are, we are completely, I think, interoperable and able to work together and understand each other. And I think we're just continuing to look for new ways to cooperate. Yeah, so powerful partner. Yes.
Newmeyer, Olmsted Scholar, class of '89. Sir,
Where?
I went to Madrid. It was wonderful.
Okay.
I spent 10 years working in Latin America with the Organization of American States and then at National Defense University with the Perry Center. How do you keep the focus of the administration on Latin America? I mean, people can walk from Latin America to the United States. They can't walk from the Middle East to the United States. How do you keep the focus of the administration on it? Because in an era of constrained resources where Southcom seems to be one of the first things to be cut.
Well, partly by inviting senior policymakers to events like this. You're sitting next to Assistant Secretary of Defense Sergio de la Peña, who is our OSD Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. There are a surprising number of senior policymakers who are intensely interested in the region. The challenge that we have is to make sure that when we look at the region, and particularly to individual countries in the region, that we see not just the challenges, but that we also see the opportunities. And it is a region that is literally ripe with so many opportunities that it takes just a little bit of effort, a little bit of invested engagement, and we think that the return on that investment can be enormous. Thanks. Yes, sir.
63 Argentina. My question is about the Dominican Republic. How do you all in Southcom work your coordination with Northcom as far as responding to the disaster there, sir?
Sure. For those who are not kind of familiar with where the regional boundary lines are drawn, U.S. Southern Command has the Central America, so from Guatemala south, South America, and the Caribbean, with the exception of the Bahamas and the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Those are all part of U.S. Northern Command. With regard specifically to the Dominican Republic, we work very, very closely with the Dominican Republic, with their military, to build their capacity. Our Army works with their Army, our Navy and Coast Guard particularly have been working closely as they kind of revitalize a Coast Guard and gain better understanding of what's going on in their vicinity. They are a key participant at our principal operational headquarters at the Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, Florida. They participate there. We have 23, at last count, of our partner nation liaison officers who are stationed there on the team at JIATF South. 17 nations are represented. A number of international security organizations, Europol among others, are represented there. And so it's their ability to be able to gather in information, intelligence, law enforcement, as well as military, from all of these different sources of information, to pool it, to fuse it, to create improved understanding of exactly where these threat networks are, how they are operating, and then to be able to pass that information out to either, in the case of the high seas and the airspace of the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, where our U.S. Coast Guard plays a principal role, but then also to the various partner nation navies and Coast Guards and military forces, to be able to, so that they can, we basically help build the picture, and then we pass it off to whomever has the authorities to be able to act on it. It might be partner nation law enforcement, it might be partner nation military, it might be U.S. law enforcement that ultimately engages in that end game. We've taken these lessons that we have learned in the U.S. military and security forces in the counterterrorism fight that we've engaged in, and we recognize that the most important thing that we can do, instead of focusing exclusively on individual commodities, illicit commodities, we focus on the networks themselves. And so the role that we play, where we have expertise to contribute, is in the detection of these threat networks and the illumination of the threat networks, and then the end game, the disruption piece, is going to be carried out by those entities that actually have the authorities in place. And so we build a team we build a network of our own to try to disrupt these threat networks. Yes, sir.
Chris Howard, I'm the token Rhodes Scholar on the board of directors.
Somebody's got to raise our game here, so.
I try. I try, and this is tough for me to say. I'm a former Air Force Academy football player, and saying that in front of Navy people is really tough. But it's germane to my question because
363 days out of the year, I am a joint officer.
But there are 2 days when you're not. Let me guess what those 2 days you're not a joint officer. I mentioned
I'm
that
not perfect.
when I graduated from the Air Force Academy, I played football there, and our team manager was a wonderful guy named Jorge Munoz, who's a El Salvadorian exchange student who went back and served in the El Salvadorian Air Force and now runs the entire military pension plan. Great officer. When I went to flight school, T-37s, I had a wonderful officer from Peru who I flew T-37s with. I was wondering, as we were talking before, Admiral, how extensive are those exchange programs, those mill-to-mill programs, bringing those officers and NCOs up into our different schools and what have you? I'm curious how extensive those programs are today.
I would say they are quite extensive. It's one of the biggest challenges, obviously, is the funding that is available, particularly to be able to bring in countries that can't afford to send an officer for 4 years. Many of the service academies now have opened up their exchange program, so for a semester they can bring a cadet to come up. And so you see all of our service academies are, including the Coast Guard Academy, that has significant representation by foreign students who build those kinds of relationships and establish that that person-to-person connected tissue. But I would say it goes way beyond the connections that we have at our service academies. It is organizations that we have, like right here in Washington. Admiral Herb, where are you there? The president of the Inter-American Defense College here at Fort McNair. How many countries and students do you have in this year's? And among the graduates of that program are multiple chiefs of service, chiefs of defense, and including the current serving president of Chile was a graduate of the Inter-American Defense College. So those are the kinds of investments that we're talking about. But we go even beyond that, and we recognize particularly as we look across our partners and we recognize the opportunities to truly create a modern, capable, effective 21st century military force. We've long recognized the key role that senior NCOs play. And so that's the secret sauce. That's what sets us apart, we think, from any place else in the world, is that qualified senior NCO Corps that exercises such significant leadership roles. And so at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Western Hemisphere School that brings in mid-grade officers, but also NCOs, and trains NCOs on a significant scale to be able to work together with us. And then within our headquarters, I mean, this is one of our military imperatives, is my senior enlisted leader. I have a Marine Corps E9 Sergeant Major that leads a team of E9s made up of the senior enlisted leaders from all of our components. The senior enlisted leader from Coast Guard District 7, we've kind of grabbed him in to make him part of our team, and as well as a Navy female Master Chief Petty Officer as part of that team to help transform and help these countries understand how to establish an NCO training program within their own countries. And so Colombia now runs an NCO academy that is the equivalent of anything that we run, and is just a superb operation. And so that's kind of the proof in the pudding. So we try to build connective tissue and relationships because we recognize it's those relationships that sustain us through, again, those political pendulum swings that inevitably occur. We found, you all remember the recent election in Argentina that led to a change in a government that turned away from kind of the Bolivarian revolutionary model to being interested in reintegrating back in with regional partners and with the West. The new leaders of each of the military services immediately reached out to us. And why did they do that? It's because 2 decades previously, all of them had studied at one time or another in the United States, at our war college, at our service schools. They had that experience. They knew who we were, how we operated, and they were eager to try to recover from a decade's absence of building that connective tissue. And so that's the kind of investments, and when we think about it, and we got to think about it like an investment. Some investments you look to pay off, in the next quarter. Some of them might take 2 decades to pay off, but that's one that I think was an enormous return on the investment. Thank you, sir. 364 days out of the year.
There you go. Well said, sir. Keep after him.
Yeah.
Sir Dave Sauvé, class of '01, Santiago. How did the Olmsted Scholar Program make you a better officer?
Oh, boy.
And have you had, in your time at SOUTHCOM, any Olmsted moments? I have them almost daily where nuance hits you. And do you have those examples?
Sure. It really is the understanding of how do you look at yourself through a different lens. Because when you spend that 2 years overseas, not only are you studying that country, but you're studying and you're seeing your own nation from a different perspective. And that's, that sends you home, I think, a more discerning appreciator of just exactly what we enjoy here. I mean, this is an enormously imperfect dream, but it is a dream that continues nonetheless. And you recognize that. We have faults, we have warts, we have shortcomings and problems, but when you live overseas and you get a chance to experience the political cultures of other countries, and particularly because just most of us, because some of us struggled to pass chemistry the first time around, we weren't going to try it again in a foreign language. We studied usually political science, history, economy, those sorts of things that really gave us a lens to look at ourselves and at the country that we were living in. And so, it makes us appreciate the strengths of other countries, the ideas that they have, but I think it also allows us to recognize our facility with which we can assemble ideas and bring together coalitions to be able to work with people in ways that we're not, I think, bound sometimes by history, or we are not confounded by preconceived notions as much, perhaps. Now, the actual experience of having worked with partners, when I find myself in a part of the world that is where being able to speak Spanish or Portuguese would be enormously helpful, yeah, my time that I spend in Bordeaux doesn't always pay off. But I recognize and appreciate people who are excellent scholars and linguists, and so I surround myself with people who are really good speakers of Spanish. And I also kind of understand and appreciate the nuances of language, and understanding, that when you get an interpretation of something, it may be very superficial, and getting the nuance of the piece. So you've got to sometimes kind of not take at face value the initial translation that you might read of something that a key partner might have said, because you got to understand there is so much, so many layers buried beneath that one fairly simple, straightforward sentence. And when you understand that context, you can appreciate what goes in behind it. And so don't accept at face value some of the things that you read, and try to build that rapport with the individual. And then I find myself multiple times as just this past couple of months when Hurricane Irma hit and wreaked such devastation in St. Martin. Our opportunity to go work with our partners there. Well, some of you may understand, but most of Washington did not recognize that St. Martin is, it's half French sovereign territory, half Dutch sovereign territory. And so, our partners, who do we work with? Typically, we work with our U.S. Embassy accredited to that country. The U.S. Embassy, a credit to half the island was in Paris and the other one was in The Hague. And the nations themselves understood that a hurricane had hit, but the U.S. Embassy didn't in Paris. And so we sometimes had some interesting challenges working through. So I will tell you what I told, I had a Marine colonel, Joint Task Force Commander down there, and I said, look, the nations, the sovereign nations that are trying to resolve these terrible problems that are taking place in St. Martin on either side of this border, they're doing the very best that they can. Their militaries are there, and we have a long-standing relationship working with the French military in the Caribbean, working with the Dutch military in the Caribbean, and we had good relationships with those two officers. And I said, whatever you do, offer whatever help that you can offer, but the bottom line is ensure at the end of this experience, our relationship with the French military, with the Dutch military, must be stronger than it was before the hurricane hit. So whatever you do, don't compromise. Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Thank you.
Sir, Mike Flynn, Nanjing, China, 04. I teach at the Naval Academy English Department, and I did my PhD in Columbia trauma narrative, so I'm a bit of an Olmsted schizophrenic, I guess you could say.
Good for you.
This will be the third spring break I take two Naval Academy midshipmen to an exchange in the Columbia Naval Academy.
Great.
And I drop them off there, and then I do my own research in Medellin and Bogota with Colombian artists. So I get a very different perspective, radically different from both. You probably know what the Colombian military thinks of the U.S. aid, but the Colombian left and artists have a different view. And they would say...
So do the American left and artists.
They say that the American aid, Plan Colombia, does more harm than good. And that I think we misunderstand, they would say, we misunderstand the complexities of the Colombian political environment, in that particularly the monies that we think is going to the right people is going to the wrong people. And that more violence is done by money siphoned through the government to paramilitary organizations than we think is going to prevent illicit trafficking in drugs. So my question is, what would you say to that criticism?
I would say that I trust the judgment and particularly the courage of the Colombian military and the Colombian National Police and the work that they are doing. I've met with and spent a lot of time talking with leaders, and you know, they've been fighting a civil war for 50 years. I guess I would just point out, we're still struggling with some of the aftermath of a civil war that we concluded over a century ago, and ours lasted 4 years. So 50 years, there are strongly held opinions in a number of ways. But I think that the commitment and the courage, the valor of the security forces in Colombia, I think is worthy of listening to and paying attention to. They care very deeply about their country. We've got in our headquarters staff, one of my directors is a Colombian general that is my director of training and coalition affairs. And I explicitly, and this is probably again as a result of the relationship developed from my Olmsted experience, I recognize if we are truly going to be paying attention to how our coalition partners think and incorporating their thought processes into what we do, if we don't have a senior representative inside the tent, who will hold us accountable for paying close attention to our coalition partners? So I told him that's part of his job, is make sure that we don't just talk the talk, but that we pay attention, that we incorporate the perspectives of our partners. And so we're finding multiple ways to be able to reach out. The other piece is, I spoke about the work that we do to train NCOs, and I said that's one of our military imperatives. We have 4 military imperatives, and they're interrelated, and they are completely interdependent. You can't take one without the other. The first one that we always talk to is inculcating, not just within ourselves, but within all of the relationships that we have with our partners, is a foundational understanding and appreciation of the role of human rights and a respect for human rights in everything we do. Not because it is somehow squishy or the politically correct thing to do. It's not that at all. It's that if you are going to be a military that has legitimacy in the eyes of your population, they have to view you as a protector and not as a predator. Now, you know, this hemisphere, there is some historical baggage that, where that has not always been the case. But we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the establishment of our Human Rights Office within USSOUTHCOM headquarters, in which this human rights initiative is foundational to everything that we do in our relationship with our partners out there. Not just preaching it, but modeling it, working with it. And I would argue that among the countries that we have worked with most closely over the last decades, Colombia has, I think, internalized exactly what that means. Are they perfect as individuals? No. Are we? No. But as institutions, they have learned the importance of human rights, and they've internalized it, and they hold their people accountable when they make mistakes, when they commit crimes. And that's, I think, ultimately, that's what we're looking for. For those of you that are counting, so professional NCO Corps, establishment of NCO Corps, critically important. How is that interdependent with human rights? Well, if you want your soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, Coast Guardsmen, to model appropriate behavior, get your NCOs on board. If they get it, if they carry it forward, it will happen. The other two that I think are critically important is helping to understand and implement the ability to incorporate all of the talent of your population. Fundamentally, what does that mean? It's, you know, for the 50% of your population made up by women, that you have incorporated them into your security forces effectively, because they bring perspectives, they bring problem-solving skills into what you're doing. You sometimes have this preconceived notion that, well, Latin culture doesn't really acknowledge or accept a leading role for women. And what we have discovered, you know, our prejudices were wrong. And we have countries in our region, probably because they have staked out an important role in UN peacekeeping operations. They've recognized that the role of women in their security forces is fundamental and allows them to understand perspectives and work that peacekeeping mission much more, I think, profoundly. But also across all of their armed forces. Now, again, like us, you know, it is a process for some of the countries where it's only been in place for maybe 5 years. So they are working their way through it. But we run every year a conference that brings together mid-grade, senior, and senior women across all the militaries. Now, this last year, what we did is we pulled together the chiefs of defense of the region's militaries and their gender advisors. And we had a conference, and we sat down around the table and talked through how do we advance this concept of being able to effectively incorporate a gender perspective in military operations. Still got a long road to go, but there's a commitment on their part. And again, you know, why is that important? Well, if you want to make sure that you're paying attention to human rights, if you have a military that makes up your entire population, that takes advantage of all the talent that's available to your population, make sure that you have women playing a critical role in it. And you'll find that amazing things happen. The last one is respecting the importance of jointness. And many of our partners understand that and are working at it, but in some respects they are kind of where we were in the 70s, where it still is very much the individual services that are the centers of gravity. But they are creating joint commands, joint operations, and all of the exercises and activities that we engage in, you know, we do them in a joint context. And they recognize that the individual services don't have the resources to solve the problems, but when they come together and work together as a joint team, and by joint, I'm not talking about just the uniformed military, but now increasingly incorporating their law enforcement professionals, their intelligence community professionals, their diplomatic corps professionals, and be able to create a true interagency synergy. That's how we've reorganized ourselves internal to SOUTHCOM, is to be able to be a more effective team in that respect. So those are the four imperatives.
Admiral Tidd.
Is that the hook?
That is the hook.
Okay.
I promised him if he spoke well, the bar would be open again, and we'd have really good food the food just got better. I want to thank Admiral Tidd for the tour de force of all that is happening in SOUTHCOM, an area that's so vital and so little is known about it. And often when people look at Olmsted Scholars, they say, Bordeaux, Tidd, I bet he knows a lot about French red wine.
I'm
He
a big
probably
fan of
does.
Malbecs.
He could be a fan of Argentinian Malbecs. But I'd like to thank you for taking the time. Admiral Tidd had meetings in the Pentagon all day today and is here tonight. He's going to stay, this will probably be his dinner, and have a drink afterwards and interact with you. But I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, representing the Olmsted Foundation, honoring us today and honoring our audience with insights into such a vital, critical set of countries that mean so much to America. And it is clear the President showed great wisdom when he appointed Admiral Kurt Tidd as our Southern Forces Command SINC. So thank you very much, Kurt.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you. Bar's open.